In The Fold, Deleuze writes extensively about the importance of Whitehead for the philosophy of events. He says this: "With Whitehead's name, there comes for the third time an echo of the question, what is an event? The question was raised the first time by the Stoics and the second time by Leibniz. In these thinkers, and in particular in Whitehead, Deleuze finds a thought similar to his own, one which stands opposed to centralization and institutional thinking, in particular of the kind developed by analytical philosophy. He even says that Whitehead stands provisionally as the last great Anglo-American philosopher before Wittgenstein's disciples spread their mystic confusion, sufficiency, and terror." So in this video we're going to see how the concept of event brings about freedom in the form of more clarity and joy, and how it liberates us from indifference. The event is a dangerous concept for centralized powers, because it introduces a profound shift of emphasis in philosophy, in particular in the philosophy of knowledge. As Deleuze says, Whitehead takes up the radical critique of the attributive scheme, the great play of principles, the multiplications of categories, the conciliation of the universal and the individual example, and the transformation of the concept into a subject. What he means here is that the event replaces one of the most fundamental concepts in philosophy, namely essence. If things are events rather than essences, then not only does it threaten established academic philosophy in its intrinsic elitism, but it also suggests that until recently, our understanding of reality was completely wrong, and that the institutions built upon this vision of things can only be corrupt, or are fundamentally corruptible. Let us compare the two views at play here. Classically, an observable object can be recognized because it is the temporal manifestation of an eternal essence or form, which we as subjects have a natural affinity with. To know a thing means to know, even vaguely, its eternal essence, and to know its essence is done by defining the attributes or set of attributes of that essence. I can know what the sky is because it is true to say that it's blue, or that it is high, or any other attribute that it may have. Here, eternal forms preside over contingent forms, and events would be whatever degradation the eternal form undergoes when it's incarnated. But for Whitehead, it's just the opposite. Everything is an event. That is, everything changes all the time, and eternal objects are not given in advance. There is a profound reversal at play in this philosophy, and Whitehead's opposition to essentialism reminds of a pre-philosophical time, of Heraclitus in particular, who said that we never step in the same river twice and that everything changes. The key point is that as opposed to a philosophy of degradation, such as is the case in Platonism, Whitehead advocates for a philosophy of creation and novelty. But a problem now appears that Whitehead must resolve, namely, if everything is an event, how can eternal things come to exist? Is it not a contradiction to say that eternal things can come into existence? Since we know that there are eternal objects, such as mathematical truths or philosophical concepts, or even the eternal part of ourselves, which we sometimes call the soul, Whitehead must explain how these things, these eternal truths, emerge out of the fundamental chaos. The solution to this problem is found in the concept of genesis. The genesis of a thing is not what a thing is, its essence, but it is the history of its becoming. Instead of determining the truth or falsity of a proposition in terms of a relation between an essence and its attributes, the genesis of an event is the movement of creation and consolidation which is found in the relation between the many predicates of a thing, insofar as they are actualized. In any genesis, Deleuze explains, there are 4 steps or moments. First, out of the chaos, which Whitehead calls the many to Deleuze's great joy, something definite appears. Here's how Deleuze describes the process. Chaos does not exist. It is an abstraction because it is inseparable from a sieve that makes something rather than nothing, emerge from it. Chaos is like a pure many, a purely disjunctive diversity, while the something is a one, not a pre-given unity, but instead the indefinite article that designates a certain singularity, as in a dog. How can the many become the one? This sieve has a special status. It is coextensive to the chaos, and as such it tells us 3 important things about it. Cosmologically speaking, chaos is the set of all possibilities, that is, all universal essences, and the filter selects some of those to compose reality. Physically speaking, the chaos is the without ground, the darkness that contains all colors, for example. As Deleuze says, the sieve is like the infinitely refined machine that is the basis of nature. Psychologically speaking, the chaos is the ensemble of all possible perceptions, a fantastic and universal dizziness out of which regulated perceptions are selected by the filter, like hearing individual drops of rain, for example. All of this composes the first condition of the event, namely extension, that is, the space which relates the whole to its parts. And when this happens, we see the formation of infinite series. Think, for example, of gravitation, which is the effect of the entire universe on each individual atom. At this level, the event can be said to be a pure vibration. The second moment of the genesis of the event can now take place. What happens now is that the infinite series, which were somewhat chaotic, begin to converge over a certain thing, or rather over a certain number of things. Deleuze says extensive series have intrinsic properties, for example, height, intensity, timbre of a sound, a tint, a value, a saturation of color, which enter on their own account in the infinite series, now converging toward limits, with the relation among limits establishing a conjunction. Think about the notes played by individual instruments, which converge in the piece that I hear. It's the creation of harmony. But this harmony occurs to all things, and the convergence here is not only about notes and sounds, but it's about all the objects that populate the universe, all the objects that can be named and that have an individual existence. These objects have the property to affect each other. They act and react like rocks in an asteroid field, if you will. And this is what Whitehead calls apprehension. It's the third moment. For Whitehead, Deleuze says, the individual is creativity, the formation of a new. This is something other than a connection or a conjunction. It is rather a prehension. An element is given, the datum of another element that prehends it. Prehension is individual unity. Whitehead defines prehension as cause and effect. It means that a cause, or prehension, seizes an effect, which is called a datum. But every cause is bound to be itself the effect of another cause, such that a prehension is always the data of another prehension, and so on. The important point here is that in the act of seizing the datum, the prehension also produces something of another nature, namely a subjectivity. In other words, the prehension has two aspects. As Deleuze says, the event is inseparably the objectification of one prehension and the subjectification of another. It is at once public and private, potential and real, participating in the becoming of another event and the subject of its own becoming. Here, subjectivity does not necessarily mean a conscience, but a point of resistance which has a very unique trait. It can delay the passage from action to reaction and essentially expand time. While the subjectivity of plants and rocks is equal to 0 or thereabout, intelligence, human intelligence in particular, has the ability to reflect on things and delay the reaction to a cause by a long time. If I see a fruit, I can collect it for later instead of eating it right away. This delay is, in a nutshell, the interiority of conscience, where feelings and emotions can take shape. It is their condition, in fact. The subject in this understanding is a special prehension, which is essentially slower than others, and which can order time. As Deleuze says, the subjective aim assures the passage from one datum to another in a prehension, or from one prehension in another becoming, and places the past in a present portending the future. The ultimate aim of the subject is to reach satisfaction, or self-enjoyment, in the sense of increased power to act, and this power to act is the ability to increase one's capacity to be affected. It is not pleasure in itself, but the sheer joy to be alive and to experience oneself. So in Whitehead's philosophy, the question is, how does something new happen, a new subjectivity, a new way for this self-enjoyment to become what it is, or to be expressed, to become more capable to be expressed? How do we create new ways to apprehend problems? This, as Deleuze says in his book on Spinoza, is where the art of organizing encounters becomes important. Here's the last problem. We have seen that Genesis is about explaining how eternal objects can appear amidst the chaos. And we have seen how in the third moment, through the play of prehensions, we arrive at the process of subjectification, or subjectivation, which is essentially an increase in the time it takes to pass from the cause to the effect. The question now is this: how does the subject come to create these eternal forms? First, let us be reassured that there are indeed such forms. As Deleuze says, there are nonetheless eternal objects. There are no fewer eternal objects. It is even the fourth and last component of Whitehead's definition of the event. An eternal object is a representation, and the question here is, how can representations emerge out of the ever-changing chaos? The answer Deleuze gives is the following. The Great Pyramid signifies two things: a passage of nature or a flux constantly gaining and losing molecules, but also an eternal object that remains the same over the succession of moments. The entity that effectuates the passage from chaos to order, from the infinite flux of change to eternal objects, is the subject. The subject is the manifestation of this passage, its private aspect, as it were. It is homogeneous to order and chaos. Its motive, as we have seen, is self-enjoyment, or to increase its ability to act, you could say, which it does by contracting and synthesizing disparate series, fixating their spatial and temporal components into eternal representations. It is in this way that we, as subjectivities, can reconcile the fact that we are both contingent, the product of past prehensions, and eternal at the same time. What we call conscience may be exactly what happens when you create eternal objects. So it is not contradictory to say that an eternal object can cease to be incarnated, or that a new eternal object can come into existence. Perhaps we can say that we do not create these eternal forms because we are intelligent, but we are intelligent because we create these eternal forms. This strange creature that says I is on the front line of the war against chaos, always at risk of falling into it, and yet feeling a strange and very unique delight whenever it can transform what it sees into an eternal form. It's perhaps why the conclusion of what is philosophy begins with the following line: we require just a little order to protect us from chaos. So these are the 4 steps of the genesis of events, according to Whitehead and Deleuze, which constitutes the basis of the philosophy of events. If you would like to know more about this, you can read chapter 6 of The Fold, where Deleuze enters in many more details. Finally, I just wanted to mention that I've been able to relocate to my new country without too many worries, and so I'll be able to create more content now in the coming weeks and months. I have a number of ideas which I think are going to be interesting, and hopefully you will appreciate them as well. But in the meantime, do not hesitate to let me know if you have suggestions or questions or comments in the comment section. And also wanted to thank my patrons for their support, which is really much appreciated. And well, for now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.